background to the English speculative Freemasonry is that we had big opposition between King James I and his court and the Puritans. Now, King James was the one who did the Jamestown colony and who did the King James translation of the Bible and all that, but he was also a big spender and kind of his court was a lavish place with lots of parties and all this kind of stuff. And the Puritans were very, very opposed to him. And there's a long story about this that I'll tell you a little bit of about some of these things. But basically the political intrigue was that the Puritan movement was gaining a lot of power because the Puritans came out of Protestant Christianity, and aside from being very puritanical, they also were in favor of ideas like that were starting to get put together, like democracy, things like that. Sir Francis Bacon is suspected as being the author of much of the Shakespeare repertoire. He was the exchequer of the king. He was in charge of the king's finances. He was the one that came up with the idea and bankrolled the idea of the Jamestown colony. He was the one who oversaw the translation of the King James Bible, did some of the translating himself, and there's much more to know about him. And he was discredited by the Puritans finally when big trials were held of trials of corruption of King James. To protect King James, he took the rap for having supposedly embezzled huge amounts of funds which had really been spent on parties and things like this. And he left the court in disgrace and supposedly died, although, and all English school children still read in their history books that he was an embezzler and a bad guy and all this sort of thing. But there's been much more that's been discovered since then. For example, the Baconian Society has in its possession a lot of his notebooks and things. He has one notebook full of all the words that Shakespeare supposedly invented. And they're his notebook, they're his words, they're his terms. And there's a long history about this sort of thing. He was kind of a secret adept. In 1620, the Rosicrucian Manifesto appeared. And it was secretly circulated among lots of people. And this is about the time that the Puritans were now getting a lot of power. And the Catholic Church was real down on the Rosicrucian movement because it was involved in Kabbalah and Hermetic sciences and alchemy and things like that, which they considered to be tools of the devil and so on. And this was a manifesto that basically said there is a secret society that is wanting to change the world and wanting to change government and wanting to make democratic government and wanting to do this and all sort of thing. There was a tremendous reaction against this and against what was called Rosicrucianism by both the Catholics and the Puritans. So they got it from both sides. The Hermetic sciences and so on were considered to be sciences of the devil. And the connection of Christian Kabbalah to Jewish Kabbalah was another kind of demonic thing. You know, the Jews were involved in these kinds of things. And so there was an attempt to, there was a fellow named Frederick, who in one of the German states was a great sympathizer with all the Rosicrucians and the Hermetic people, who had a very good chance of taking over this little state, which would be near what today we call Prussia, and turning it into an ideal state, just like Plato had been once taken. He'd gone and tried to help a king to establish an ideal state, and it didn't work. Well, this state failed because at the last moment certain allies didn't come in who were supposed to help militarily. And when that happened, then the Rosicrucians were really on everybody's list. And about this time, the Puritans had a revolution in England. They beheaded King Charles, chopped his head off, and said, no more kings. We're going to have, you know, a democratic government. We're going to have an elected prime minister sort of guy who's going to run things, and his name is Cromwell. And so all of a sudden, the kings of England were no more, and England was ruled by a Puritan named Cromwell, and it became a kind of a theocracy. Cromwell had many of the same ideals as later Freemasonry would have. In fact, in this portrayal of Cromwell, you see a lot of some of the images that we'll find in Freemasonry are attributed to Cromwell, but he was not a Freemason. There wasn't any Freemasonry yet. And as a matter of fact, he was an enemy to most of the things that esoteric Freemasonry stood for. There are some people who tried to make a case that he was a secret Freemason, but he probably wasn't. But he was definitely in advance of the idea of democratic governments and a constitution and a republic and that sort of thing. And he ruled in England for 20 years. He was the head of large armies, and he fought Scottish people and other kinds of people. But one of the most famous stories I like to tell about him is that the Puritans had decided that Christmas was a pagan holiday, and so was Easter. It was not truly Christian. It was not in the Bible. And in fact, they are. They're pagan holidays. I mean, they could tell that Jesus was born in the spring because it was when the lambs were being born and all that kind of stuff. And they knew that Easter was from Esther and the Easter eggs and all these, the chopping down the tree was Druidic. They knew all that stuff. So they forbade the practice of celebrating Christmas. They didn't dare try to stop Easter, but they did try to stop Christmas. And so Cromwell and his people declared that there would be no celebration of Christmas. And he would have riders and criers riding through the streets of London on Christmas Eve saying, no Christmas, no Christmas, to remind the population not to dare do this. And this, of course, did not make him very popular. And that's why his whole government eventually failed. They were trying to do things that were more than they should do. And he also made a prohibition of any public assembly of Rosicrucians and other Hermetic heretics. So they were not allowed to assemble in public in order to discuss their interests in astrology and alchemy and theurgy and Kabbalah and so on. And as a matter of fact, here is a cartoon from the era showing, by all the anti-Cromwellites, showing Cromwell as destroying the great oak of Britain and cutting it down, and they call it the Royal Oak of Bretagne. And if you want to read all the little things, which you can do if you have this on the internet, you'll see a lot of very interesting little comments about what Cromwell was doing to England. So there was a lot of negative feeling about that. Well, I should say something about Rosicrucianism. This is discussed more fully in other places, but it's based on the legend of Christian Rosenkreutz, who had traveled far and wide and studied with many great initiates and then come back finally to his place in Germany, where he offered the secrets of his arts to heal people of all kinds of things, but he was rejected. And finally he got together with some brothers who were also monastics. They were Christian monastics, monks. Remember, this is in Germany, which was never really controlled by the Catholic Church. And they started a little group. And they then, these brothers would be trained to go out and sent into other towns where they would perform healings, and they would heal the sick and so on. That's what Rosicrucianism was, but it was using esoteric means and astrology and alchemy and all these things, which were already in use by modern medicine. So-called modern medicine back then used astrology to prepare things and so on. And the brothers would meet back once a year on C Day, which is, C is the Roman numeral for 100, is 100 days after the beginning of the new year, which is in the end of June, early July, when we have our synod usually. Well, there were many noble and middle-class Templar families now, and they had connections with alchemy and the Hermetic sciences. And this was spread to other families, and so there were many people very interested in this who had survived from Templar times. And there was a need for some kind of legal public meeting. Now, the Masonic guilds, which were very tight with the Templar families, the stonemasons, could meet legally in pubs and other places under Cromwell. And that's where they usually met, was in pubs. And they would have their meetings and they would conduct their business. And that was legal under Cromwell's reign, which is about the middle of the century. These guys would have some rather bawdy meetings, and the stonemasons would go in and drink at the pubs and have a lot of fun and do things like that. Well, the aristocratic families had been Grand Masters, for example, the Scottish Masonic operative lodges and other kinds of things, and they needed a place to meet. And alliances had existed from ancient times between the Templars and the aristocratic patrons the protectors of these guilds, and they were owed favors. And the solution was that the English aristocrats and associates could be inducted as non-operative Masons in the English lodges, and therefore they could come and join the lodges, and they could meet in public, and they could then carry on the results of their researches. There was no internet, there was no telephone, there was no postal service or anything like that. And so this is the way, as you know, that's why the internet is such a powerful thing in the world today, is that you get connection between people and then things start happening. So this is the connection between Masons, Templars, and Rosicrucians, and a lot of the early English Freemasonry was esoteric Freemasonry. The first recognized speculative Freemason was that we know of, is supposedly, according to the scholars that you're dealing with, was Elias Ashmole, who was a Hermeticist and an alchemist and the author of the Chemical Theater and Ceremonies of the Most Noble Order of the Garter, which still goes on, and the founder of the Ashmolean Collection of the British Museum. Is a very famous man, and he was initiated as a stonemason. Why? Well, he had something to do with building buildings and things like that. But he was a very brilliant man who was probably secretly a Rosicrucian and certainly a Hermeticist. He was a student of John Dee. If you, we missed the last section when I showed you the section on the Goetia. We ran so long I wasn't able to show you the section on John Dee. I hope you went back and looked at it, because you had learned about this very brilliant man who was instrumental in magical sciences and so on. But he was a student of John Dee, and he was an ardent apologist for the Rosicrucians. He was always defending them. He would never say he was one, but he was always defending them. And in Warrington, Cheshire, on October 16, 1646, he was initiated as a non-operative Freemason. And by 1990, there were 4 of these speculative lodges in London. Now, by 1990, I shouldn't say 1990, that should say 1790, I'll correct that. By 1790, there were 4 of these big lodges that were nothing but speculative lodges, and one was in York. And these lodges were very free to operate, because by about 20 years before that, or 25 years before that, Cromwell was kicked out and the monarchy was restored. It's called the Restoration. And that's where we got Crazy King George and all that sort of thing. But so now they were free, they were off, they didn't have to even be doing that. So they still call themselves Masons, because that's what they were doing. And so the membership had strong interest in Hermetic sciences and alchemy. Sir Francis Bacon may be the true founder of what we think of as speculative Freemasonry. Ashmole is claimed to be the actual founder of it, or of Freemasonry itself, but Francis Bacon is more likely. As we said, he was oversaw the creation and the translation of the King James. He's the architect of the American colonies. Probably the author of several of the Shakespearean plays, and there's a whole lot of evidence about that I won't go through right now. And he was the founder of the Order of the Helmet, which are called the Spear Shakers, which Shakespeare was probably named after, Willie Shakespeare, who was called Shakespeare and so on. And the Order of the Helmet was an order of anonymous people who were working behind the scenes, because the helmet of Athena would convey invisibility, and they were called the Spear Shakers. But anyway, the Freemasonry seemed to be based and structured fraternity on ideas that were in Francis Bacon's New Atlantis. So they certainly were a lot of influence from his writings, whether he himself personally was involved. Basic ideas of a democratic society based on science, and became Freemasonic philosophy, deism, and it was a foundation for the U.S. Constitution and many other things. And from Bacon Masonry, which is a wonderful book written by a professor up at the University of California in Berkeley, he shows a lot of the connections between the earliest Freemasonry and Bacon's ideas, and Bacon was a cipherist. He was involved in in designing secret codes all the time for the king to use to get secret messages. And so many of his ciphers, we've applied his ciphers to other things and found things in the Shakespeare plays that are ciphered by his ciphers that say things like, Francis Bacon wrote this, and things like that. Here's a title page of Bacon's Advancement of Learning. It shows, what do we see up at the top? We see a Masonic handshake. And this is, 20 years before the first lodge. And you can... so there's a lot of stuff to study here. I'm just opening it up and showing it to you. This is only one of scores of things, and there are many ciphers and other evidence that connects Bacon with Freemasonry and also with Shakespeare. It's a very interesting study. So if you want to read this book, Bacon Masonry, I think it's worth looking at, because he's found a lot of interesting things that conventional Masonic scholars don't want to look at. So by 1717, there were 4 lodges, and they formed a Grand Lodge. They decided that real Freemasonry began in England, not in Scotland. So it was going to be the English Grand Lodge, and they were going to determine what other lodges would form and so on. And then there were rival lodges. There was the Ancient of all England, and one south of the Trent, and there was rivalries going on for who's going to rule Freemasonry, because it was a big deal now. Most aristocrats were into this. And by 1775, we had the first of the higher degrees developed. The original 3 degrees were the regular building trades degrees, first, second, and third, which were apprentice to master. Now we have one on top of that called the Royal Arch. We have the building of Freemasons Hall, and then we have the American Revolutionary War led by American and French Freemasons, who were all brothers of each other. And the French, of course, were the enemies of the English, and the French helped the Americans win their battles. And there were even English Freemasons who were brothers of the American Freemasons who secretly communicated with each other. It's quite an interesting story. By the 1800s, we had royal family, members of the royal family who were initiated, and we had a united Grand Lodge in England. And so this is sort of shows you how this went and where it began. By this time, the interest was still in the esoteric things, in alchemy and all the other esoteric hermetic sciences. And it was not really another religion, but it was a form of philosophy called deism, which believed that, which connected science and religion, science and spirituality, and saw the two as being inextricably bound to each other. In Scotland, which is probably the original speculative area that Freemasonry was developed, it probably is Scottish, Mother Kilwinning Lodge claims to date back to the building of Kilwinning Abbey by operative Masons in the 12th century, which it probably does not do, but they claim to have a claim to much greater antiquity than the English Freemasons, and this is a source of friction between the English and the Scottish. This is Kilwinning Abbey. Rosslyn Temple, as I say, is evidence for connections a couple of centuries before English Freemasonry. The Scottish Lodge was finally chartered formally by the English Grand Lodge in 1771. Remember, that's where England now rules all this area. Cromwell had ridden through Rosslyn Chapel as he was defeating all the Scottish people and stabled his horses there and done things like that. Robert Burns was one of the great Scottish Freemasons. In the early 1700s, it went to France, and there were guards of the exiled Stuart royal family that were Freemasons, and they brought it to France. And the lodges then would be chartered by royalty rather than by a Grand Lodge. And in 1728, we had finally an English Grand Lodge of France, and then the Grand Orient of France by the end of the 18th century versus the Grand English Lodge, and the French said, no, Freemasonry belongs to us, we will control French Freemasonry. And in 1877, the Grand Orient had so much connection with people that were of other religions, like Hindu and Islamic and so on, who were becoming members of Freemasonry, and there are Turkish Freemasonic lodges, they're all over the world now, that they dropped the term Grand Architect of the Universe, which was the deist idea of God, which was basically the Judeo-Christian concept of God. And they started allowing people to take the oath on the Koran and other things that were important to them. And the English Grand Lodge cut all relations for this irregularity, which they considered to be atheism. And from that date on, the English and the French have never gone along. Now the English get along with the Americans get along with the French, and the Americans get along with the English. So the Americans are the only ones that are really in communion with all these people. In the late 19th century, women's Freemasonry was developed, co-masonry. And in the 20th century, the Grand Lodge Mixte de France, which gave us our charter. And now the Grand Orient of France consists of 6 major Masonic obediences, including the Mixed Lodge, which is men. This is called a trestle board. It's an architectural drafting board which becomes a symbolic summary for each degree of Masonic initiation and advancement. Notice the skull and bones up at the top. This is a French version. You will find that in English Freemasonry that the trestle board was used all the time. We have it in American Freemasonry. It's a summary of the symbolic knowledge. Masonry is about symbolic knowledge. Here someone is being instructed in it.
Is there a correlation to the tree of life?
No, it's a little different than that. Here's a reception of a French master mason at the point of a sword after he dies and comes alive again and all that sort of thing. The French rites are a little bit different than the English rites. In Pansophic, we tend to use a combination of both. So Masonic philosophy was deistic. If you look at the development of scientific investigation, which really begins with the alchemists in the West, and then Roger Bacon's experimental approach to finding out what worked and what didn't, and then the Fratres Lucis, who supported all kinds of scientific investigation in the 15th century, that's the 1400s. Then we have the Italian Academy of the Lynxes, which became a scientific academy in the 17th century. And then we have Sir Francis Bacon, no relationship to Roger Bacon, and his New Atlantis about science and reason. And then we have, in the 17th century, English Freemasonry and the scientific societies that resulted from English Freemasonry founded the Royal Society, which is the first great royal scientific society of the British, the Royal Society of England. And Ben Franklin was in contact with Priestley and Lavoisier and English people and French people when they were doing their first experiments with electricity and the different forms of air and gases and things like that. And this is where science was starting to really develop and separate from the road of alchemy and things like this. So here's Franklin corresponding with his French people, Lavoisier. And the idea of God as a grand architect of the universe, like the architect who makes a building. He builds the universe and he sets it all in motion like a great clock. And so it's kind of the Newtonian mechanical universe is the idea of how things are. They're all set up to run. God doesn't have to make them run. God is absent from the universe, although he can come back in. But it runs on its own laws, and you have to try to understand what those laws are because they're the laws of God. In the period of the Enlightenment, in the 18th century and 19th century, the whole development of what was called a social contract versus monarchy was developed. The idea that the ruled had to have the consent of the ruler and the ruler had to have the consent of the ruled, and the development of these ideas like democracy, and some of the great writers like John Locke and so on who created the idea of a social contract that the government had to serve the people. And there was this, at the same time, in Freemasonry, originally the lodge masters were royalty themselves, or they were aristocrats. Now they would be appointed by aristocrats, and now they would be elected by the lodges on the model of the Greek election. form of the Greek election, the black and white stone election, which is yes or no, and it's a secret election where no one has to know how somebody votes. And so now you have some of the lodges, mostly in England, are now democratic, and they're electing their officers, and their officers run through terms and new officers come in, and people go up the ranks. And in France, where they're appointed by royalty for life because they're masters, they are in fact masters, they are adepts. But except pretty soon they weren't adepts, they were just fools that were being appointed by somebody, and people didn't like that. So science and reason were supposed to be a basis for spiritual faith. Jefferson and people like that, although Jefferson was only marginally connected with Freemasonry, all of his friends were Freemasonic, and a lot of his ideas were very involved with that. He brought a lot of these ideas into the American Constitution. Even the Declaration of Independence, which he mainly authored, contains these ideas as justification. That, for example, things are, it is, how does he put it? It is evident that this, and he uses scientific terminology and ideas of natural law and things that should be done, and the ideas of social contract and so on. And then we get to the period of Illuminism, which is a spiritual social philosophy of the Enlightenment, and that produces the Illuminati. These are the inner court Freemasons of Germany very often, who are the architects of things like the French Revolution, to overthrow the monarchy. Weishaupt and the Bavarian Illuminati, who fomented violent revolution against monarchies and had very elaborate, secret, and sometimes very dangerous initiatic things. This is Weishaupt. The first American college fraternities were based on Masonic Illuminism. And so there are links to the Illuminati. Now, by the way, the Illuminati is not a secret thing that rules the world. It was just a movement in Freemasonry back then. And I happen to, right now, am a Grand Master of that particular charter, hold the charter for that. And I can guarantee you that there's no big, world conspiracy.
That's what you say.
That's what I think. But for example, that they did come into the early American society because they were all very idealistic about the new world. And so the first colleges and universities that were established, they established fraternities and societies among them. Phi Beta Kappa was established by the Illuminati. Skull and Bones was established through the same thing. It was these are basically secret fraternities of rich kids who got really good grades and got admitted and all this sort of thing, to teach them their responsibility as wealthy people to their society. And it taught basically Masonic ideas about it, but it was in a kind of a different modality because it was kids at college and this sort of thing.
And wasn't our president part of the Skull and Bones?
Did he get in?
Yes, he did.
That's what she
Well,
said. Not all of them.
but see, his dad was a member.
Yeah.
Oh, that's how we
So,
got it, yeah.
yeah.
Well, but Skull and Bones is not now what it used to be. It's just, it's degenerated so badly. Anyway, there were mystics like Jakob Böhme, who were part of this Illuminist movement, and his student Gichtel, who made him very famous and brought his teachings to Blake and Saint Martin and so on. There was Swedenborg, who was an Illuminist mystic. Emanuel Swedenborg, who established his own rites of Freemasonry. They're still done in Lutheran territories and so on. They developed the Swedenborgian New Church. And, Johnny Appleseed was a Swedenborgian who was spreading Swedenborgian tracts all across the country along with planting apple seeds. And there were Masonic Illuminists like the Comte de Saint-Germain, who went through the lodges in Europe reforming them. Before and after the French Revolution. There was Cagliostro, who was a very powerful healer and had received a great deal of esoteric education and was really seriously maligned. by people that wanted to destroy him. And he introduced the idea of Egyptian Freemasonry, which eventually comes out as Memphis, Mizraim, and so on. And the rites of Memphis and Mizraim then become higher degrees of Freemasonry that go beyond Royal Arch and things like this. And there are already higher degrees like the Templar degrees and so on. And then there's Martinez de Pasquales, who's a great, who began the whole, the Elu Cohen movement and so on. It was the theurgical movement that we haven't studied yet. Villermoz and the Elu Cohen and San Martin and Martinezism and Martinism, all of which we haven't yet studied. And all these influences were there, and this is one of the influences we still have from the Masonic Enlightenment on our dollar bills. We have the pyramid with the missing top, the missing capstone, and the eye of God, and which is a symbol of many things, like the mystical unknown, the mystical lost word of the Masons, and different kinds of things that this is associated with. Now, in 1783, Pope Clement issues the first papal decree against the Freemasons, and they're tortured by the inquisitors. Remember, they're mostly Protestant, they're not Catholic. And European Masonic lodges today are still anonymous. There are no signs or markings. When you go to a European Masonic lodge, you have to know what the address is, and you have to do a special kind of knock on the door to get in. But here in this country, everything's big signs up because we're the land of freedom. And the function of the tiler in the European things is the tiler is a person who watches the door and makes sure that there's no bad people coming in or no cowans coming in or anything like that. Very important function. It's not really much of a function in America. America was a land of Masonic freedom. It was founded by Masonic founders like George Washington. The contrast is between the European ones and the American ones. You go anywhere in any small town, and it'll tell you where the lodge is and what their hours are and how you can, join if you want and so on. So the Catholic denunciation continues to the modern day, to modern times. Catholicism, the popes consider it to be, and are always trying to portray it as they're eating the blood of babies and they're doing all kinds of evil things. And if you run into your fundamentalist people that you have to, help to go into the transition and so on, they're going to believe that the Freemasons are the devils and all this kind of stuff. They've been taught that. So they created a thing called the Knights of Columbus as a kind of counter brotherhood. That's a thing the Catholics did all the time. They created dummy orders that were the opposite, that had esoteric names, and the Jesuits often did this to deal with ones that were going around that were, heretical and so on. And of course, the 20th century Christian fundamentalists, I should say 21st century, spread false rumors and conspiracy theories and things about Freemasonry, and it's quite a struggle. Here was a Freemason, Anton Mesmer, and his theory developed of animal magnetism and Fohat. And he experimented with psychic forces, which was a step further than theurgical forces. Casanova was a famous Freemason. You hear of him usually as being a great lover and this sort of thing, but he was actually a great esoteric Freemason. He was prosecuted for being a heretic and put in a place called Leeds. He was such a resourceful person, he actually escaped. This is Casanova. This is the court where he was convicted as a heretic. This is the place where the jail at Leeds is, and this is the cell that he was in, and this is where he escaped, outside. Comte de Saint-Germain, there's a great deal to learn about him, but there are many legends about the Comte de Saint-Germain. Count Cagliostro and Countess Serafina were very famous in Europe. He was a healer. He healed people for nothing, and then he also was patronized by wealthy people, and he went around reforming Masonry and introducing the higher forms of initiation. He was put in the prison of San Leo, where Cagliostro, where where he actually died. Cagliostro died. He was one of the last victims of the Inquisition. This is what the prison looked like, and this was another view. And he finally died. Now, American Freemasons were the architects of the American Revolution. George Washington, here he is in his Masonic apron. They were the architects of American democratic institutions, the Constitution, so on. Ben Franklin, here he is in his Masonic garb. Most U.S. presidents, I'll be corrected by what percentage of U.S. presidents?
It's actually more like 25%.
25%.
And they were all more in the earlier, in the...
Yeah. When I put this up, I was talking about most U.S. presidents in the early period were Freemasons, and later on it became different. But here's Harry Truman in his Masonic garb. There was a movement against Freemasonry because it had gotten too powerful by the 1820s and so on, and there was a great deal of feeling that these people had too much power and they were too much of a secret organization and too many people were on the outside.
They nominated William Wirt as their candidate. Wirt was actually a Mason. I don't know if they even realized that, but they formed that in the early 1800s. And there was also the, now the name just escaped me, there was that journalist who was going to write this big expose and he disappeared, and then there was this big scandal, and the Masons went from being heroes to the villains almost overnight, and it was a big catastrophe for American Masons.
Well, they should have, because they killed a guy. They punished him, just as the vow said. They slit his throat and cut out his tongue.
Well, they never found the body, and there was some disagreement. I can't remember the name, but whether he was even, nobody found any records showing that he was ever initiated. So maybe you know something I don't know.
Well, I've read some things about it too, and I've looked at, but the thing
William Morgan. William Morgan.
This happened. A big scandal happened. You see, this is a men's mysteries, men's group, and the old boys can get to be pretty funky sometimes. Not George Washington, but some of these other guys out in these little counties, in southern Georgia and places like that. They got a little funky with the way they initiated people, and even today you have problems with that you'll read in Masonic journals about some lodge that was doing an initiation. They decided to add a few more. It's more like an initiation into a college fraternity or something, and the vow that was taken was a vow that if people ever revealed things about what they had learned, that they would have their throat slit and they would this and that, And some people, some good Masons took that seriously, apparently, with this reporter. I don't know. But anyway, Masonry lost a lot of its influence for a while after the time of Andrew Jackson and so on. And by the time of the Civil War, and Freemasonry was revitalized by Albert Pike and other people, and it became a very powerful movement again. If you go to the Grand Canyon, all the names of all those big mountain-like things in the Grand Canyon were named by Masons. They went there and they named them, and they named things like Osiris this and all kinds of things, And you find Masonic stuff in the exploration of the New World, a very, very important thing. Every little town had its Masonic thing, and that became a place where people met other people. If you wanted to do business, if you wanted to be supported by other people and all sort of thing, you had to join the Old Boys Club, and that's the way it was. And there was an intellectual arm, and there was more of a business arm, and it was, this sort of thing. So after the middle of the 19th century, the 1850s and so on, the Scottish and the York Rites were in competition with the other higher degrees, which were called the Egyptian Rites. And eventually they won out, the Scottish and the York Rites, and the Egyptian Rites are now, we still have some of the rituals up to the 30th degree in the American College of, Masonic College of Rites and so on, but they're not practiced But Memphis Mizraim, which goes up to a 99th degree, is practiced in some esoteric circles and in Europe. So this is basically, these are the two ways of going into beyond the first 3 degrees, the Blue Lodge degrees, the York Rites way and the Scottish Rite way. And this sort of compares the two. The Scottish Rite is one with all the steps, lots of steps. To be a 33rd degree Mason, you would have spent your life doing this stuff.
But these now, at least in the United States, these are communicated like over a weekend.
Yeah.
And they don't even put most of the degrees on. They communicate them.
And they don't even know what they mean. But
Hey, now wait a minute.
except for him, of course. Daniel's probably the only Mason in the whole country that knows what they mean.
I wouldn't say that, but I pay attention to Lewis's lessons, so they definitely enrich my presentation.
Well, I just know that I've been several times, before I was even a Mason, I was approached by Grand Masters of Scottish Rite Freemasonry twice, different lodges, who wanted me to sit down with me because they didn't understand any of the degrees. And the reason is these degrees are kind of museum frozen takes of real initiatic schools that used to exist. Rosicrucian things and Templar things and all this, and these are degrees. And they're all related to biblical themes and things like that. But if you really were going to really be initiated in Rosicrucian stuff, it would be years and years, but here you do it overnight along with 3 other things. But it's a way of memorializing the initiatic history that is emblematically preserved in Masonry. So there's a tremendous Catholic and fundamentalist attack on Freemasonry. And then we had the advent of male-female Freemasonry. And this is still very much resisted by most people in Masonry. Each person in Freemasonry is a building. He's a temple of God, like the Temple of Solomon. He's an unfinished temple, and has within himself all the parts of the temple, the altar and the columns, and all the parts of the temple of Solomon's temple are within you. Masonic craft symbols are used for moral principles. A stonemason would take a rough slab of marble and he would hew it into a smooth slab. So this is called the rough ashlar, and you were supposed to make your personality, your person and your character into a smooth ashlar by dealing with your faults and your defects. This is the Bible was what this was based on, the law, but it also has now become the Quran and the other kinds of books that are used in different Masonic initiations in different places. The symbol of the square and the compass is used when you're initiated, when the compass needles are completely covered up. Then you don't know anything much, you're just an apprentice. But when one is uncovered, then you are in a fellowcraft, and then when they're both uncovered, you are a master mason. There are various symbols like that. The Pythagorean theorem is a very important thing. It's a very important building squares. They've found spiritual interpretations of that, of the trowel, which puts together the mortar that's going to hold the bricks of the building together, which is going to hold you in brotherhood with people even of different political opinions and things like that. The sun and the moon, which are representative of the forces that operate from the Grand Master and from places in the lodge which face east. And especially the lambskin apron that you wear, which is symbolic of the work that Masons do, but it's now symbolic work. And whether this, the top of this thing is opened up or partially opened up, etc., is a representational of how aware you are, how much Masonic light you have received, what degree of initiation you are, and so on. There are philosophical symbols. We mentioned the skull. It's not just a symbol for piracy, it's a symbol for death, which we all come to. And a symbol of the sands of time running out is a symbol that we have to make good use of our time while we have it, because we never know when it's going to end. The Masonic day is divided into 3 8-hour segments, one for work, one for sleep and one for prayer and refreshment with families, etc. And there's a great deal of moral training that's done in the Blue Lodges. And believe me, a lot of people need it today. This is a symbol of the all-seeing eye, the omniscient eye. This is a symbol of the grand architect of the universe. This hat was a symbol of the bourgeoisie, of the middle class that opposed all the wealthy rulers and everything, the monarchs back in the earlier centuries. And so the middle class, the people wore these hats, and they still wear them proudly because we represent the democratic people versus the monarchs. This is a symbol of the broken column, the acacia, and the sands of time running out, and time with his scythe and all this sort of thing. Is a reminder of the fact that that we're all going to face this, and we don't know when, and there's much more that can be said. But you're going to do a Masonic wedding, so you're going to learn some things about that, probably just by watching the ceremonies as well. This is a symbol you very often see on Masonic buildings in the United States. The G may be for God, it may be for geometry. There's a big argument about it. But when you're initiated, you'll have 3 lights, 3 candles. You'll have a Bible or a book of your choice there with this symbol upon it. And you'll kneel before the altar to take some kind of an oath. In Pan-Sophic, we don't take oaths about slitting throats and things like that. And we talked, and no, you don't have to have your breasts bare and all this sort of thing, but you will go through an initiation of this sort. And you will learn some signs. When Masons travel to other countries, there's no way that a Freemason who is legitimately a master would know how to recognize a master from another country. So there were secret grips, hand grips and things like this. You saw this done. There are other signs. There are many other kinds of signs and things that are done for people to recognize who they are when they travel to foreign countries. Here's a master with the altar and the lights and the candidate and the conductor who is initiating a young gentleman into Freemasonry. And here is a person giving the Dugard, and there's many other symbols that we could discuss, but these are all taught as part of a moral system of responsibility of the individual towards himself, towards his family, towards his community. And these are principles that were much more powerful in American history than anything that these people today that have these fundamentalist churches and all say, well, these are the basic American principles. No, these are the basic American principles. This is what built America. That's what made it strong. That's what ran the country. So here we've looked at all these traditions, the Masonic guilds through the Comocene community, the European Hermetic Renaissance develops, the Rosicrucian Enlightenment comes along, esoteric Freemasonry now draws from all these sources and becomes a place where the esoteric traditions of Europe are protected literally from the Inquisition and from the Puritan Inquisition. You see, there was not just an Inquisition by the Catholics, there was an Inquisition by the Protestants. The Salem witch trials was an Inquisition by the Protestants. In its defense, I will say that in the United States of America, in Salem, Massachusetts, after they had already done horrible things to people, the judges there finally realized that they were wrong. And they wrote a letter that they circulated to the other inquisitorial Protestant courts in Europe, said, "We are wrong. This is not correct. We're not doing the right thing. This is not how it works. We've got to stop doing this." And so actually the Inquisition actually ended in Salem, Massachusetts. But the Protestants did the same damn thing that the Catholics did, except they didn't have all the torture equipment and everything. They just dunked them in water and did things like that. But basically, this was a place where the underground stream was protected, and where which was heretical, that which was Gnostical, Hermetical, and all these other things that are part of what we call the Graal tradition, had a place to be now institutionally protected, and had finally a nation, a country that it could go to where it was safe to actually operate in. And after the French Revolution, France became that way as well. First the American Revolution, then the French Revolution. And all of a sudden, the Inquisition starts to lose all of its power, the papacy starts to lose its political control, and the world becomes an entirely different kind of world and a different kind of spiritual world.